Okay, I see attendees are filing in. This is sort of a pre-program administrative session where I think we just want to, I myself and my fellow panelists, give a little background on our respective organizations. My name is Clint and I'm from the Stimson Center and 38 North. 38 North is a program of the Stimson Center, which is a nonpartisan policy research center in Washington, D.C. It was founded as a not-for-profit in 1989, and as a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to enhancing global peace and economic prosperity by identifying pragmatic solutions to current and emerging global challenges. Initially, it focused on arms control at its founding, but its research agenda has since expanded to include a broad range of critical security issues focused around 4 key themes: protecting people, preserving the planet, promoting security and prosperity, and grand strategy in pivotal places. The Stimson Center envisions a world in which the historical tendencies towards injustice, criminality, greed, and violence are defeated by the positive forces of peace and prosperity. And I want to highlight just a few things for our audience today, and I've posted some of this in the chat function, so hopefully it's visible to you. I've shared links to the Stimson Center's website, but also 38 North's website. And Stimson is constantly working to adapt to the new environment and runs various virtual programs that are often open to public viewing. So please check out the website for more details. And for more of a Korea focus, check out 38 North's website, where we post new and original commentary and analysis each week. And also in line with today's particular panel, I've shared a link to a recent report which we published on 38 North about the US-South Korea alliance, which came out of discussions we held with a broad range of former US and South Korean diplomatic, political, and military officials, which highlights various points of tension and potential future scenarios in the alliance relationship, which we'll likely touch on some today. So without further ado, I want to hand things over to my colleague, Steve Lee, who will give some background on the Korea Defense Veterans Association, or KDVA.
Okay. Thanks, Clint. Again, Steve Lee, the Senior Vice President. So KDVA is a nonprofit organization based in Virginia with a chapter in South Korea. Our membership is free and it's open to US and South Korean veterans of the Korean War as well as defense veterans. And to put that number in perspective, the number of Korean Americans alone who fought in the Korean War, about 5.8 million. And then those who served since the signing of the Armistice Agreement in 1953, we're talking about 3.3 million. So roughly about 9 million folks can join our organization. Our mission is very simple. It is to enhance the Iraq-US alliance and support those who built the alliance and continue to serve it. We have a website and about 22,000 followers on our Facebook. We post daily news and relevant information about the alliance. To commemorate the 70th year of the start of the Korean War on the 25th of June, KDVA is going to be hosting a 2-part webinar series. The first one is on the 25th of June, and it'll be at 8:30 Eastern Time. And this is where we're going to have Korean War veterans and family members to talk about their wonderful stories and basically explain how they think that fighting the Korean War to them was worth it, even after 7 decades. Then the following day on Friday, the 26th, again, same time at 8:30, we'll have the second part, where we talk about how the Iraq-US alliance can work together to fulfill their legacy, to ensure that both South Korea and the United States continue to live in security and prosperity. So we hope that you'll get an opportunity to check us out. Please go to our website, kdva.vet, and just let us know if there's anything that we can do for you. And again, really appreciate this opportunity to participate. Thanks, Clint.
Thank you, Steve. Jiayan? Oh, Jiayan, I think you're muted.
I'm muted.
Okay.
There we are. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome and thank you all for joining us for today's program, the US-South Korea Alliance Amidst Uncertainty. We're really delighted to be hosting this dialogue in partnership with the Stimson Center and Stimson's 38 North program. My name is Xiaoyan Zhao. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. We are a hub for international exchange, dialogue, and learning located in Louisville, Kentucky. As a member of two national networks, the Global Ties US and the World Affairs Councils of America, we facilitate a variety of international professional exchange and youth exchanges, many of those through the US Department of State. And we provide speaker programs and educational opportunities for the Kentuckiana region throughout the year. While we are a member-supported organization, we are not member-exclusive in our programs, which are all open to the public. And we are committed to ensure that you still have access to expert analysis and discussions on topics that impact us locally, nationally, and globally, especially during this period of global uncertainty. So I'm really delighted to be partnering with, for today's program, with this exceptional panel of experts from the Stimson Center, the American College of National Security Leaders, and the Korea Defense Veterans Association. And with that, I'm going to just throw it back to Clint to get the program started with the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiaoyan. And also thank you to the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana for helping to organize this panel. Before we get started, I just want to extend my own personal well wishes as well as those of the Stimson Center and 38 North to all our attendees. This is a very uncertain, sort of tumultuous time in our country and in the world. So we want to extend our well wishes, and we hope everybody is healthy and safe, and your families as well. So COVID-19, which we're all experiencing together, not only reminds us of how globally interconnected we are, but also that many factors influence national security, which do not look like conventional threats. Consequently, how we think about national security is evolving. And moreover, how we think about alliances as a crucial component of our national security landscape is also changing. And among US alliances, few are as long-standing as that between the United States and South Korea, otherwise known as the Republic of Korea, or ROK. Nevertheless, US policymakers and the public mostly pay episodic attention to the Korean Peninsula. When they do, it is often through the lens of crisis as a result of North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, or more recently, speculation about Kim Jong-un's death. Yet the importance of the US relationship with the Korean Peninsula, and South Korea in particular, extends far beyond Kim Jong-un's nuclear stockpile or his health. Nowadays, though, there is substantial concern about the future direction of the alliance. But it is often difficult for Americans to see why they should care about such issues. And of course, due to domestic turmoil and a contentious presidential election just on the horizon, people have even less bandwidth to give to Korea. So in the spirit of our local virtual event, run in partnership with the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana, I thought I'd point to a few salient connections between this part of the country and Korea. First and foremost, and of particular salience as we approach its 70th anniversary, are those who served in the Korean War. According to the US National Archives, 921 Indianans, or Hoosiers, and 886 Kentuckians lost their lives during the 3-year conflict. And as Steve mentioned, you can add to this tens of thousands of other service members from Indiana and Kentucky who either served during the war or have been stationed in South Korea over the 7 decades since. Today, Indiana and Kentucky together send roughly $2 billion in exports to Korea, which account for roughly 10,000 jobs. And for those of you joining us in Louisville, Kentucky, just across the Ohio River at the port of Indiana Jeffersonville is a steel plant opened in 2017 by South Korea's POSCO Steel. Moreover, about 20,000 Korean Americans call one of the two states home. So the point is that while Korea may seem very far away from southern Indiana and Kentucky, there are quite a few ties that bind. In the spirit of that connection, and in an effort to bring you the voices of military officers and expert analysts with hands-on experience on and around the Korean Peninsula, we've organized today's panel. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. First, Major General Rick Martin joins us from the American College of National Security Leaders. Rick served 36 years in the US Air Force as a commander, pilot, and staff officer. And among many other important positions, he served at the Pentagon managing political military policy on the Korean Peninsula and as a delegate with the State Department during negotiations with North Korea. Alongside General Martin is Colonel Steve Lee. Steve is a Korea expert with over 20 years experience working in Korea, the Pentagon, and the intelligence community, and is currently the Senior Vice President of the Korea Defense Veterans Association, or KDVA, based in Northern Virginia. Steve has been interviewed on NBC's The Today Show and Fox News, and has moderated and participated in numerous panels about the U.S. ROC Alliance. And lastly, but certainly not least, is my colleague and manager, Jenny Town from the Stimson Center. She is a fellow at Stimson and also the deputy director of 38 North, which is a website devoted to providing policy and technical analysis on North Korea. And in addition to her research, Jenny has experience in track 2 diplomacy with North Korean officials. So she brings a wealth of experience and insight to today's discussion. So without further ado, I want to turn to a sort of interview style conversation with our panelists. After several questions, we're going to turn to you, our audience, for a Q&A. So if you do have a question already, or if you have questions that arise during our conversation, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A box, which is open to you, and we will queue them up. I do ask that when you ask a question, please identify yourself, any organization with which you might be affiliated, and also if you do have a particular panelist in mind, specify to whom you're asking the question, if there is a specific one. Okay, so I want to turn to the first question, and I want to direct this specifically to Rick and Steve. And when we think about the US-South Korean alliance, and indeed alliances in general, a shared threat or a mutual adversary is crucial to its formation, but also its continuation over time. However, as the relationship has evolved from its early Cold War origins, I want to ask, what additional reasons are there for the alliance beyond just deterring and defending against North Korea? In other words, historically, the primary factor underpinning the alliance was security and mutual defense. What additional factors exist today? Can we start with you, Rick?
Sure, Clint, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, Zhao-Yin, as well, and good to be partnered with Steve and Jenny. It's good to be talking about the alliance on the eve of the 70th anniversary. You mentioned the evolution of the alliances and where we've been and where we're going. I like the characterization that you're familiar with regarding 3 phases. The first was a blood alliance from the Korean War to about the Cold War. The second was a traditional alliance from the Cold War through about 9/11. And now we find ourselves post 9/11, a strategic alliance. And throughout its 70-year history, there's no doubt that this alliance has remained strong. But what made it strong? I believe a commitment to a shared understanding of its purpose, as you talked about, to deter and defend North Korean aggression. That purpose has evolved, and I see 3 additional factors that weigh on the strategic alliance that we now find ourselves. First, I believe there is a more militarily capable and uncertain North Korea, especially in light of their missile testing, their pursuit of nuclear weapons, special ops capabilities, and cyber capabilities. Number 2, I believe there is increased external pressures and players that weigh on the alliance, whether that's China, Russia, South Korea's relationship with Japan, or economic pressures that affect the stability and security on the peninsula. And third, I'm going to use the term interoperability. The reason I say that is because South Korea is a stronger country and a stronger military than the past. They're very capable. As such, there are opportunities to work together as alliance partners, capitalizing on the interoperability of both of our militaries, not only on the peninsula, but other mission sets, whether that's freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, or cyber capabilities, or defeating a COVID pandemic. We can learn a lot and work together. So in this framework, I see an alliance that is characterized less by what the US does for South Korea and more what we do together, what we do with the Republic of Korea. Now, are there points of tension? Absolutely, sure, like any relationship. But I characterize those as alliance maintenance issues, not a reflection of capability. The alliance is capable and strong, make no doubt. It has evolved, it has adapted, and it has at times struggled. How can we address those struggles? How can we better address the forces tugging at the relationship? I think that's through C2. That's a common military term, but I don't mean it in the normal military terms sense. I mean it in C2 as in communication and coordination. The importance of communication and coordination in this alliance can't be overstated. So in summary, as the title of this webinar suggests, there is some degree of uncertainty. However, uncertainty doesn't mean crises. And the US ROC has a strong history of dealing with uncertainty. And it's better to continue to build trust on this side before a crisis develops. I see this webinar, and thank you very much, helping to affect that trust. The bottom line, the Alliance, the Combined Forces Command, is strong and ready. Together, we are ready to fight tonight.
Thank you, Rick. Steve, would you like to address that question?
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm coming to you live from my home in Potomac Falls, Virginia, which is in Northern Virginia. And just want to give a quick shout out to my fans, my wife Grace, and my 4 kids are in the other room. They're listening in, so really thankful to be able to join here. So, you know, both the United States and South Korea have mutually benefited from this incredible alliance, this partnerships and the friendships that have developed over 70 years. And there is nothing quite like it. There is this image I'm going to share with you here, and you've seen it before. What it does is it shows you the great success of South Korea with its hardworking people and their great leaders. And then obviously supported by the ROC-US alliance. And then the utter failure that is North Korea in literally seeing the black. They're literally in the black. And then when you look at the different statistical categories that compare North Korea and South Korea again did this as a world leader, mainly by their people, hardworking, some of the hardest working people in the world, but also because of the great support that comes from the alliance in all facets of it. Sure, the security is an important part of that and underpins the ability to diplomatically, economically, really blossom as a country. So there's no question about that. As mentioned by our 2 previous speakers, you know, as we're going into the 70th commemoration, the start of the Korean War on the 25th of this month here, it's really important to recognize that 70 years ago, you know, North Korea's strategy was to unify the Korean Peninsula on their terms. Unfortunately, that hasn't changed. And so the reality of the threat exists, unfortunately. So again, you clearly see the failure that North Korea in the way that they do things versus the alliance. As Clint said earlier, Kentucky sends about $2 million of exports to South Korea, 10,000 jobs for Indiana, Kentucky. And overall, the ROC-US trade is about $130 billion. And so that clearly shows you how this alliance, I think, is very important, and there's just really no questions about it. So with that, Clint.
Thank you, Steve and Rick. I like, Rick said it, but I think you both highlighted it, that it's not so much what the US does for South Korea, but it's what they do together now, and that's a key sign of that evolution. I want to turn to Jenny and ask about North Korea, which Steve, of course, mentioned. And speaking about that aspect of this all, we saw North Korea, of course, accelerate its weapons development in 2016 and especially in 2017. But then it seemed to take a sudden shift toward diplomacy in 2018. What exactly was accomplished in those 2 years? I know a lot of people are wondering this. And where does the relationship between the US and North Korea stand now? And sort of a follow-on to that, what is the status of North Korea's nuclear program?
Sure, thanks, Clint, and thanks for having me on the panel today. You know, I think the diplomatic push in 2018 seemed incredibly promising to many at first, but was perhaps overly optimistic from the start. It's good to create an air of excitement at the dawn of new negotiations, but this is such a hard target case that expectation management is incredibly important as well. And what we saw in 2018 was that expectations were sky high, especially from the South Koreans. North Korea was going to denuclearize and quickly. The end of the war would be declared by the end of the year, and peace and economic cooperation were right around the corner. But this optimism was not based on any consensus. There was no advanced consultation or consensus on an approach or a collective bargain between the US and South Korea with North Korea before Moon signed the Panmunjom Declaration in April of 2018. That committed measures that required cooperation from the US especially, and the UN more broadly to implement. So I think there was a sense that if this was the path the two Koreas were choosing, who would stand in their way? But for the US, North Korea's nuclear program is always the core of the issue. And the question was always, what was North Korea prepared to do on the denuclearization front and how quickly? And then how to sequence in incentives and measures in other areas to make that happen. I think essentially you saw the US DPRK talks stall out over fundamentally incompatible expectations of sequencing and value propositions. So North Korea wanted an action for action formula negotiated phase by phase, whereas the US generally was pushing for a let's agree to an end state, what are we working towards, and then negotiate the phases. So North Korea offered what they can, so both sides basically wanted quick results, and what they expected as those first wins was drastically different and led to frustrations very quickly. Furthermore, the value propositions didn't match. So North Korea offered in Hanoi what they considered to be a big concession, Yongbyon, the heart of their nuclear weapons program. But the US dismissed the value of Yongbyon, considering it isn't the full breadth of their fissile material production capability. And so North Korea offered what they considered a lot and asked for a lot in return. And the US still wanted more to give the kind of concessions that on sanctions that North Korea was looking for. So both sides ended up, of course, walking away empty-handed, as we saw. So since then, these fundamental propositions from both sides still stand and stand in the way of progress. In the meantime, North Korea continues to develop its WMD programs, test new conventional weapon systems, and vowed in December of last year to reveal a new strategic weapon soon. Although what that new weapon is unclear, and soon undoubtedly was delayed due to COVID-19. So at least one positive in this is whether by choice or circumstance, North Korea is still adhering to a moratorium on nuclear weapons and long-range missile testing, the kinds of actions that would trigger the kind of fire and fury that we saw in 2017. Things aren't that bad yet, but North Korea's capabilities are still advancing. And so North Korea just a day or so ago, severing the communication lines to South Korea, and with the US well into the election cycle and dealing with domestic turmoil, the prospects for resuming either US DPRK or inter-Korean talks in the near future are bleak. North Korea is focused instead at the moment on strengthening its domestic economic infrastructure and management in the face of sanctions and border closures due to COVID-19, and trying to instill confidence in a domestic audience that a failure of diplomacy to bring about quick results did not leave the state weaker. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jenny. As usual, very comprehensive response. Thank you for highlighting the, I guess, silver lining. I don't want to call it a hopeful note, but it could be worse, sort of the takeaway, right? I guess that's where we're at. It could be worse. Hopefully it doesn't get there. So I want to expand the scope a little bit, broaden the scope of our discussion and talk about or explore how the US-South Korea alliance fits within what I would call the wider strategic tapestry in East Asia. And Rick alluded to this when we talked about external pressures, China, Japan, Russia, economic pressures. But more specifically, COVID-19, as we've been watching in daily news reports, has intensified an already growing strategic rivalry between Washington and Beijing. So how can the US-South Korean alliance traverse this admittedly difficult road ahead? And I suppose I'll shoot to Steve to respond first.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So the ROC-US alliance is a key component of stability in East Asia that is becoming more contentious and uncertain. And that's another reason why a strong ROC-US alliance matters to folks here in the United States. I think we are at an upswing of tensions in East Asia. China is becoming more assertive in all forms of its national power. And the key advantage that China has over the United States in the region is that they're there. And they've been there for a long time with thousands of history in the area. And they also take a long view of the future in the region versus us in the United States, where we go through a 4-year election cycle. But the US has advantages as well. And in my opinion, that's the long-standing and important alliances in that region. But the problem right now is that the US has been taking a fragmentary view of East Asia. This is dangerous when you understand that China sits in the middle, literally in the middle of Asia, and is mobilizing all facets of its national power to target US allies and US influence. You know, in fact, the Communist Party has a stated policy of using economic, political, and military power to try to intervene in sovereign countries' internal affairs to engineer consent for its own policies. It's sort of scary. We still have great opportunities, though, to work as an alliance, specifically with South Korea. The US, I think, needs to take a look at the overall longer picture without taking South Korea for granted. So one of the concerns of long-standing alliances is that from time to time, we can forget about how important we are to each other. And I think we're in one of those time periods, unfortunately. So the US and South Korea must coordinate, I think, on and work together on China. This is so that we better understand how we look at China, look at better ways to understand how China might act to try to drive wedges in the alliance and interfere in our internal affairs, and then to build a better trust about our thinking about China. When China acts against South Korea or the United States, I think we need to support each other. So for example, South Korea retaliated against the US THAAD deployment in South Korea. Let me just do a quick note on THAAD system, or Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System. It is a defensive system for intercepting missiles as they come back down to Earth to hit its target, okay? Those are the undisputed facts about that. So by deploying this system to counter North Korea's growing missile capabilities that Jenny talked about, the alliance was just taking prudent defensive measures. Unfortunately, the alliance spent too much time, in my opinion, in internal negotiations and did not spend enough time quick enough to act against Chinese narrative that the THAAD was aimed at China and that it was a danger to China. And I thought that was unfortunate. So I think that that example is an important lesson learned for the alliance about needing to work together, communicating effectively to counter China's assertions in the region.
Thank you, Steve. Rick? Rick, where you're muted.
Sorry, Steve, you gave a great on-peninsula experience perspective. I really appreciated those comments. I would agree the importance of the alliance reigns is front and center here. China is very much present, as you said. The Indo-Pacific region is a priority for the United States, and currently the United States has a contentious relationship with China, and that causes unease for South Korea. How do we get beyond that? How do we deal with that? It's right back to coordination and communication to provide clarity on our alliance. We attended a conference back in January, sponsored by the Unique Korea Foundation in Seoul. One of the participants there talked about the military term kapshi kapshida, and that's a Korean term that means we go together. But his point was, we go together. Where are we going? And that's kind of what we're talking about here. We need to communicate that. We need to have these consultations and be clear on our intentions. that will help build that trust, that sacred trust, that two-way trust that people talk about here. I talked about my daughter's up where you are right now, Steve, in the military. She's up in Washington State, and she's in a relationship with her boyfriend. And we talked about DTRing. Well, what is DTR? It's called defining the relationship. And when they started talking about that together, the peace of mind between the two of them was remarkable. So I think that applies to an alliance perspective too. Let's DTR, let's define the relationship continually, frequently, often, and go forward together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Jenny, would you like to bring up the rear?
Yeah, I'm afraid I have a less optimistic view of where the alliance is today, less positive view of where the alliance is today. And I agree with Steve, I think we're at a moment where the US is really taking the relationship for granted. You know, I agree also with General Martin when he talked about how the alliance has gone through different phases, and we're in a phase now of a strategic alliance. However, over this administration, this is not how the Trump administration has approached alliances in general, and instead has approached it more as a transactional alliance. And that really causes a lot of hard feelings. It causes a lot of tensions that are unnecessarily so and counterproductive when you are trying to increase also the adversarial, when you are increasing the adversarial relationship with China as well. So, you know, if we want Korea on board, if we want a strong US ROC presence, there has to be more than budget discussions going on, and there has to be, you know, greater consultation, communication, as General Martin said, and the Koreans have to feel real value as a strategic partner, and not just and not just a bank for the US military.
Thank you, Jenny. I like disagreements. If we're all agreeing, then why are we here, right? So I had one other question, but you know, these things fly by, and we want to incorporate our audience's questions, and thankfully we have quite a few of them. This is my fault. I should have said up front, please make your questions shorter rather than longer. So I've done my best to sort of adjudicate between them, and I see there's some overlap. But what I want to hit on, because I know people ask this question a lot, was asked by somebody named Robert Perrone. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And Robert asks, do you really think North Korea has reunification under their rule as a practical goal? It was noted that this is, of course, it's in the Constitution. It's been a talking point for as long as you know, the relationships existed. But do you actually think that this is something they're pursuing? And I think, Steve, you had mentioned this, so maybe I'll direct that to you.
Sure. You know, a lot of things about North Korea, we need to understand that the perspectives matter. You know, we can look at North Korea and go, you know, this is a country that their numbers are just so minuscule that they should not matter. But they do have capabilities, nuclear and missile technology, that matter for security reasons in the area. But that's not the way they see themselves, right? Or at least in terms of how they interact with different players in the region. So we look at it and go, yeah, that makes no sense. There's no way that they could unify the peninsula on their terms. And no one, I think, from the United States or South Korea would argue that. Okay, they can't do it. But they had that as a stated goal and strategy. And I think it's very important for his own internal control, Kim Jong-un. And that's his number one goal, is regime survival. And part of that is to just continuously talk about, hey, we've got this capability, and then particularly to his internal audience, he's got to say, we're powerful, we can stand up to these people, and if we need to, eventually we're going to reunify the Korean Peninsula on our terms. So again, in terms of practicality, at least from our perspective, no. But for regime survival and the way that the North Koreans look at it, it is something that we have to take into consideration as serious.
Thank you, Steve. I know Jenny has a comment on this as well.
Yeah, I agree. There's a difference between practical and ideological. And I think it's the same way that South Korea always talks about unification also, whether or not they truly believe that this is coming in the near future. But I think Kim Jong-un is different than what his father was, what his grandfather was, in the way that he thinks about the country. And I think, as a practical goal, they're looking for more of how do they now move from survival to prosperity. And co-prosperity in that aspect was one of the big goals of inter-Korean cooperation going forward, with this eventual, lofty end of the road goal of perhaps unification and social and economic integration in the future. But even in those formulas, the North Korean concept of that is still based on the 2000 agreement, where it was still, one state, two governments. It wasn't a all under one system sort of arrangement.
Thank you, Jenny. Rick, do you have something to add to that?
Just not to carry it out too far, but just the road to the future starts with diplomacy. We need a strong, ready military. We need economic sanctions, some accountability there, but we need doors to diplomacy. And I saw that with the Soviet Union, serving with fellow Soviet officers and building those relationships. And only through those personal relationships did we learn more about the Soviet Union. Did they learn more about the West? Was there perhaps a breaking down of their staunch opinions, and arguably helped to break down the communist perspective and open up that country? I have hope. I think there's real practicality in helping a relationship, not just with the alliance, but we need to also have some dialogue with the North Koreans.
Thank you, Rick. That's always an interesting comparison, the U.S. Soviet and U.S. North Korean relationships. It's not one-to-one, but just such deep-seated animosity, yet the ability to still traverse that towards a new type of relationship. I want to turn to another question. I'm going to do my best to sort of fuse two questions that hit, excuse me, a similar theme, which is inter-Korean relations and current events. One was asked by Se-Young Kim from the Voice of America, and also Justin Reeve from the Heritage Foundation. Justin, you asked a few questions, so this is one of yours. I'll start with Se-Young Kim's because I think it hits a similar point, and it's North Korea escalates inter-Korean relations with the leaflet issue lately. North Korean defectors and other civic groups in South Korea sending anti-North Korean leaflets across the DMZ using balloons, and this is something that it's not new, but it's sparked lately, and it's led to recriminations from the North Korean side, and also shutting down the inter-Korean military hotline, which came out of some of the earlier inter-Korean agreements in 2018. And the DPRK, North Korea, says that the U.S. is keeping close coordination. That it is keeping close cooperation with South Korea is ridiculous. That's what the North Korean officials say themselves. And so she asks, what should the U.S. ROK alliance do to adjust against the DPRK's new strategic plane between the U.S. and the ROK, reflecting this current dispute? How can the alliance adjudicate this process as North Korea seemingly shuts down all inter-Korean exchange? I'll start with Jenny on this.
I mean, it's a good question. I think when U.S. and South Korea talk about close coordination going on, there is close coordination going on certain issues and certain aspects. There is still the bilateral working group talking about, what opportunities there are in inter-Korean cooperation. And how the U.S. and South Korea can work together on those aspects, but certainly there isn't coordination on every single decision that happens. And the decision recently for the South Korean government to go after those North Korean defector groups, I'm almost positive was not a consensus view between the U.S. and South Korea. And I'd have to say too, it's unfortunate. The optics don't look good, especially coming after a North Korean ultimatum that the South Korean government would bend to these ultimatums in that fashion, I think, opens the door for North Korea to be more and more demanding, knowing that South Korea will keep accommodating these kinds of threats. But I think, what General Martin was saying before is just communication is really necessary. And I do question right now the US ability to do multiple things at once, given all that's going on here in the US with still COVID pandemic, rising again with the racial tensions that are going on and all of the calls for defunding and all the attention on these domestic issues, as well as the disbanding of the original negotiating team in the State Department. I think there's a lot that the US would have to do to rebuild that capability to have the level of cooperation you need going forward, such as appointing a new special representative for North Korea policy, and remanning that team if they're really serious about tackling this issue together in the near future. And, as the North Koreans may be waiting to see what happens with the US elections, I think the US may also be waiting to see what happens with the new elections before they fill those key positions. And I think until that happens, we're going to have a lot of miscommunications and a lot of kind of miscalculations.
Thank you, Jenny. Steve or Rick, would you like to, Rick?
Yeah, just good comments, Jenny. I would just like to double tap the need for Korea experts in government. You mentioned State Department envoy. I think it applies in DOD. It applies in the National Security Council. And to have that strategic planning function and capability that is necessary to be thoughtful, forward-looking, and not a one-trick pony, to be multi-dimensional, multitaskable. We need that more than ever right now. And it gets right to the heart of filling positions and the continuity of those positions within our government for both leaders and advising and staffs.
Clint, can I just add one more point? And, I think the other thing, if we're really serious about being better coordinated on these issues, is we have to resolve the SMA negotiations. This has obviously gone on too long. It's created a lot of bad feelings. It's hard to imagine a scenario where we are in close cooperation on the same page until that's out of the way. And so I do hope that gets resolved soon.
Yeah, so, I obviously agree also, SMA, the sooner we can just get that off the table and don't have to worry about it, because there's so much negative energy that's devoted to it, the better for both sides and for the alliance. So I really like what Jenny said at the beginning about, there's such great optimism at the beginning of the Trump administration in terms of trying to deal with North Korea in a way that North Korea had never seen before, right? So not necessarily all bad that that Trump was different, okay? So 2 years ago, I was the only U.S. person inside of the Blue House's security control room during the first Panmunjom Summit. And I was there as a representative of the United Nations Command. And it was amazing, this sense of optimism. I remember sending a text to my kids right after that saying, hey, we possibly have taken the first steps towards, a peace process. Something that was unthinkable. And so the point I'm making there is it's great that, yes, we have some problems with having experts in key positions, but there's been a great deal of work in the last 2 years about what a peace process could look like. Because before 2 years ago, there really wasn't that much attention to it. And so why I think that's important is it gives us a much fuller picture and options in trying to deal with North Korea, as opposed to just being totally focused on denuclearization.
Thank you for all three thoughtful responses. I'm gonna do again what I did before, and in this case try to fuse three questions, but they hit on similar elements, and they bring up SMA as well. These come from William McKinney, Brigadier General William King, and also Bruce Klinger from the Heritage Foundation. And I will pose Bruce Bruce's question and add a little portion of Brigadier General King's. He writes, and this is for Rick and Steve, have the current SMA negotiations stalemate and the US decision to remove troops from Germany impacted ROK thinking on the alliance? Will it push President Moon to push even more strongly for OPCON transition prior to agreed upon conditions being met? And then following on that, Brigadier General King writes, what do you see as the required efforts or way ahead to further reunify our historical strong trust in common goals and objectives? Rick, could you start off?
Sure. Well, you've offered a couple topics there: the SMA negotiations, the NATO troop reduction, which was announced recently, and OPCON transfer, those kind of things. On SMA, I think what happens in NATO does inform a relative degree of impact, certainly on another alliance, as important as the US-ROC alliance, sure. But I think the facts are different, obviously apples and oranges in many respects there, but it is informing, and it may, we have to be careful to separate where there are differences, but also understand where there's convergences. On SMA, I would agree, the sooner we get beyond that, the better. I think we need to be incremental, like we've been for the last many decades, that we can't just one big shot. We need to incrementally deal with it here. Both countries are coming to the table with good intentions, I believe, for their own best interests, but we need to bring experts, deal with it, and move on. We are, in many regards, as Jenny mentioned, transactional, but this is more than being transactional. We're about a commitment. We're about a strategy, and those principles are at play here. This is not how to make a near-term dollar at a long-term impact or a long-term cost. OPCON transfer, I think we have to be very careful here about that and be sure that we're, again, coordinating and communicating there. That's been an ongoing dialogue within the peninsula, and I think there is an opportunity for that going forward, but he's right. We don't want to be premature there. The HASC chairman, Adam Smith, highlighted recently that 2021, 2022 seems premature, but let's let the conditions, the capabilities of the ROC, their ability to handle the North Korean missile threat, and the overall environment, the three conditions for OPCON transfer. Let's deal with facts.
So
Thank you.
I think for some of our in our audience, they may not know what this OPCON transfer thing is. So let me just explain very quickly. So the operational control of South Korean military during Armistice, which we're in right now, falls under the South Korean chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Okay, so they coordinate with the 4-star general in Korea, the ROC U.S. Combined Forces Command. And that's currently General Abrams. But when there is a decision to go to war or a crisis gets hot enough, then the operational control of South Korean troops goes under the commander of Combined Forces Command. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. So yes, there's conditions-based, and the reason why we're doing that is because the situation in the Korean Peninsula is dynamic. The threat from North Korea continues to persist and develop. And then there's domestic politics, both in South Korea and the United States, that need to take into account, because all of those factors go into making the actual decision of when we're going to actually have a 4-star general from South Korea lead the Combined Forces Command. Now let's just make sure we clearly understand what that means. Nothing changes. It's more like, for military, like a change of command. Going from an American 4-star general to a South Korean 4-star general. They both must report to both countries' national command authorities for combined decisions. Okay, so again, a lot of factors that go into when the actual OPCON will happen. And yes, the current president of South Korea wants to try to do it before his term ends in 2 years. And right now we seem to be on track to do that.
Thank you. I wanted to turn to a question, again, that sort of fuses a question that Zhao Yin, a partner with the World Affairs Council, poses, and one that Justin Ree poses as well. Zhao Yin writes, what other channels are there to advance the relationship between or among the three parties, meaning the US, South Korea, North Korea? Cultural, educational, etc. Is there room for these kinds of exchanges or channels of communication? And I might just add what Justin asked. Are there any reasonable measures for peace that are still left on the table? So sort of in that vein, are we just totally turning away from the past efforts, or are there pockets of opportunity? And I'll start with Jenny on that.
I think there are still opportunities there. We're not just throwing out everything that happened over the past 2 years. The problem becomes as North Korea starts weapons testing again, if it does cross those red lines, of course, it will make everything much more difficult, and probably all the diplomatic stuff on hold until the situation calms down again. But you know, we have a situation now where, while in normal times there would be some of these other channels of communication, such as educational exchanges, track 2 diplomacy, these kinds of things right now are very difficult to do because of sanctions and because of the US travel ban on US citizens and frosty relations in the inter-Korean sphere as well. So one, you need a willing North Korean partner if you're going to do these things, and two, you need to navigate the sanctions regime these days in order to even do these informal types of meetings. So I think, you know, there is still channels through humanitarian organizations, and there are still humanitarian delegations that go in after we get through COVID-19 and quarantines and stuff. So there's been a lot of obstacles, especially in the past 3 months, that have put a lot of these things on hold, that hopefully once the COVID-19 gets out of the way, at least some of them will start to pick up again in the absence of formal government communication going on.
Steve or Rick, Rick, I see a hand there. You want to follow up?
Sure, I can comment here quickly. I think good comments by Jenny there. On the military side, I think there are a lot of opportunities that we've discussed. I think one might be, we have some avenues, some established bilateral with the ROC, MCM, military consultative meetings and security consultative meetings that happen at the senior levels of our two militaries. Could there be an opportunity to invite the North Koreans to a subset of that, to a plenary session, to something that would open up the mill-to-mill exchange that I saw with the Soviet Union? I think there's an opportunity there. Could we invite the military, North Korean, to a conference in Hawaii at the Asia Pacific Center? Could we extend in an unclassified, obviously, a non-threatening area, opportunities for those dialogues? I think the answer is yes. I think right up front, though, early here, let's reestablish the cross-border communication, the liaison office, and the communications link. One thing that's really telling here, gets back to Jenny's and earlier comment here that I had about staff and expertise in each of our governments. We need to work from a bottom-up, not a top-down approach. When it's top-down and some things are edicted and we're trying to achieve a summit without the proper groundwork and framework, foundational, I think that can break down. And that's where I think we proceed very deliberately, very intentionally, very carefully with proper economic sanctions, military readiness, but clear diplomacy to open up these avenues of dialogue.
Steve, would you like to add on to that?
Sure. So, you know, the Korean history is thousands of years old. And only in the last 70 years has there been this unnatural break. And the reason why that matters is Korean people are Korean people. Okay, you can graphically remember when, 10 years ago, when Kim Dae-jung went to visit Kim Jong-il. If you remember when he got off the plane, Kim Dae-jung was much older and senior. And the way that Kim Jong-il went out and shook his hand showed in just a quick, short little clip, his deference. He understood that he was the older guy, okay? And so when you look at the North Korean defectors who come across, once they start to assimilate and understand the South Korean culture, and they clearly understand that things are much better. Information is how they figure out in North Korea that, hey, life can be better in North Korea. All the stuff, South Korea, and all the stuff that I've been told by the regime for years has been wrong. And so the informational, the cultural, all the things that happen under the surface as we try to negotiate North Korea's nuclear problem really does matter, in my opinion, in helping to continue to raise the connectivity between North Korea and South Korea, so that when there is a decision to strike deals and talk about a peace process, the actual process and the integration of the two countries will not be as hard. So I really think that any kind of the softer approaches towards North Korea need to continue on all fronts.
Thank you. Jenny had a quick follow-up, I think, to Rick's comment.
I have a quick follow-up to both.
To both.
Yeah. So, Rick, I agree with what you say. And at the same time, I think there is ample will in both the US and South Korea to have that connection and those communications and those types of opportunities. Unfortunately, right now, what we see is the North Koreans are not willing to do it right now. And so, yes, it makes sense to have the ground up approach. It makes sense to have the working level meetings, but the North Koreans are not agreeing to the working level meetings, even though the US keeps trying to pull them back into it. So it does take two to have a negotiation. And I think right now we certainly can't agree on the terms of negotiation, even whether it will be working level or summit or these things. On Steve's points, I would add to that, that when it comes to thinking about integration and of course, the more points of contact they have to dispel some of what they've learned in the propaganda about the other, I think this has to happen in South Korea as well too. And what you see now, especially in the National Assembly, with the National Assembly member denigrating one of the North Korean defectors who was recently appointed to the National Assembly as like, know your place and, you're not really one of us. I think this is a big experiment on how far we have to go still in inter-Korean cultural exposure and social exposure if we really want unification to be a possibility in the future. South Koreans are still banned from accessing North Korean media. There's still the national security law, pretty draconian measures. There's still very government-controlled access of South Koreans having access to North Koreans as well. So I think a lot of those domestic issues in South Korea also have to be addressed as we're also trying to reach out to the North Koreans on different channels.
This is a very fruitful discussion. I want to keep it going, but unfortunately, like all things, it must come to an end. We have some other questions that are great, which we're not going to be able to get to, unfortunately. One asking about the rift between South Korea and Japan, which of course is an important angle to this and how it might affect the alliance. And also when it comes to sanctions, China has to be involved in addressing the sanctions issue, to draw down in sanctions or getting them to put pressure on North Korea. And how do we adjudicate that process as Washington and Beijing are increasingly at odds? It's definitely food for thought. I know our panelists had some closing remarks they may want to give, so I wanted to give them the opportunity to quickly do that now. Rick, would you like to start?
Sure, I'll keep them short here. Thanks for the opportunity to engage on this topic of the alliance. There's no more important military or geopolitical area in the world. Number two, The alliance is a key facet of security and stability in the peninsula and the entire region, and it's better to be discussing these issues now rather than in a crisis. And then finally, thank you on the eve of the 70th anniversary to those veterans, particularly who are online here or in the region of Southern Indiana and Kentucky, who fought in Korea, and those who've served in uniform since and their families. This is significant. And the issues that we talk about here are on the streets of America, and the streets of America need to find themselves and the voice in the halls of Congress, because Congress needs to weigh in as well to help us manage and fund and help direct our future relationship on the peninsula. Thank you.
Dave?
Yeah, so thanks to the Stimson Center 38 North, the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana, and the American College of National Security Leaders for this really important and actually fun webinar. The Korea Defense Veterans Association, really sincerely appreciates the opportunity to partner with such important organizations to advance understanding and advocacy for the irreplaceable ROK-US alliance, because there's nothing like this alliance and nothing can replace it. I also want to really thank Dr. Clint Work. Clint is a true professional and a rising voice that's needed in the dialogue about Korea in both the United States and Korea. I look forward to working with General Martin, Jenny, and Clint again. And then finally, I echo General Martin. Hey, the veterans who fought the Korean War and the defense veterans who have served in Korea since, there really is nothing more, we can't do enough. And so as we come upon the 70th commemoration, I think all of Americans and Koreans need to pause and reflect and be thankful.
Jenny, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, just a quick, I want to thank World Affairs Council for having us here, and Clint for your moderation today. I agree that this is so much blood has been shed and so much has been done to build this alliance that, I think it's certainly worth fighting for to keep. But I think it's good that we have the 70th anniversary coming up to keep attention on this issue as well, because in the face of everything else that's going on in the world, 2020 has been a pretty crazy year. That, this is, as everyone has said, a very important strategic area and a very important strategic relationship that shouldn't be ignored even while other things are happening. And I think hopefully we can continue to have these discussions to make sure that attention remains on this area to help push us forward.
Okay, well, I just want to again extend thanks to everybody without writing down the list. You know who you are, and again, echo the sentiment to those who've served. And, as I said at the outset, what's frustrating but exciting about this relationship is that on the one hand, it's so long-standing, it's so deeply institutionalized, but it's paid such little attention, and only when it really affects us. And so it's programs like this that we hope ever so slightly can move the needle and to get people more involved. And as was said, one great way to do that is to talk to your representatives about it. This is a democracy after all. And so engage our representatives, keep their eye on this. And even if it's only to prevent things from getting worse, as Jenny alluded to, that's an important part of the battle. So thank you again for everybody who joined us. And we extend, again, our thanks and well wishes to everybody moving forward through the rest of 2020. Have a nice day, everybody.
Thank you.